So we all know the typical names that will huddle around that initial point as we get into collecting. We know Submariners, we know Speedmasters, and many other watches out there that are leading the charge for people that are getting into the hobby. But what I want to do in this video is look at that next tier of watches, watches that are absolutely important from a historical perspective, but not maybe the watches that everybody thinks of first when they're getting into watch collecting. So these are the watches that most maybe new enthusiasts don't know about, but they should know about it, and really is that next phase of collecting. I'm not gonna go so far to say that you need to have these watches in your collection. That is not my stance here in this video, but just generally speaking. But watches that I think are important to understand and relatively sitting next to some of these icons that we think about all the time, Submariners, Speedmasters, watches that maybe don't get the same shine and should perhaps more as you're getting a little bit further in. So this is that transition from novice to maybe getting a bit more seasoned in your collecting knowledge. So what will qualify a watch to be on this list? They can't be obvious choices, ones that are not going to be, if you're first getting into watches, a watch that's right top of mind and everybody collectively understands as an important watch. It has to come with some nuance in the package. Further, this can't be so far into the weeds where it's like a micro brand and nobody knows about it. Yes, if you know about these watches, that might show that you are in a deeper phase of your collecting journey, but that's not what I'm trying to do, is pick like the deepest of cuts for watch collecting, because that wouldn't really serve a purpose here. Really what I'm trying to get at is watches that are underserved are very important and almost represent, like, for someone that's getting into watch collecting, yes, these are important. Yes, Submariners, Speedmasters, you should know those, but you should also know these and be aware of them. That's really the position of this video. So before we jump in, we just released a brand new piece of content on TeddyBaldassarre.com. It is behind the scenes of our business. So if you ever wanted to see how we shoot watches, how we shoot these videos, how we manage our productions, in addition to how we ship out watches and really understanding what goes on behind the scenes, we have a full video on this. I'm gonna roll a quick trailer so you have a better understanding of what it's all about. Today we're gonna be showing you behind the scenes of what happens at this company and what I do on a day-to-day basis to bring you guys the content. So you're gonna see a lot, and you're gonna see a lot of people and really what happens here. I think one of the things that, if I look back and I can say the best decisions I've made, one was hitting the record button for the first time. It's so many people that allow this to happen, and like that's how we think all the time. Figure out what you're good at, what drives you, and you can stay motivated with, and I think good things can happen. At least that's what happened with me. If that looks interesting to you, it is available for free to view on TeddyBaldassarre.com. This whole purpose of TeddyBaldassarre.com and some of the content that we have there is really just ways to us to go deeper into subjects that might not work on this YouTube channel, and then also feature other leaders in the industry, other experts in this field who can share more about the nuances of watch collecting and beyond. So if that seemed interesting, check it out down below. We have other videos available to view as well, but really excited about this one and might give you a better understanding of what goes on behind the scenes here at this company. So this first watch on the list, some might be asking, wait, how is this one of the watches included here? But I'm gonna give my reasoning. So what I'm speaking to specifically here is the Seiko Turtle. Now, I talked about in the intro, it has to be relatively underappreciated by comparison based off of what maybe is brought to the table. And when it comes to the Seiko Turtle, this is a watch design that really helps set the stage for so many other watches that people consider before it when looking at Seiko's catalog and in dive watch history. The silhouette of the Turtle design was one of the most important for dive watches in the 70s, and as that continued to extend out to other collections from Seiko. You also saw this with the SKX. The SKX could not run if the Turtle did not set the foundation to actually take off from, with the crown position, how the case has more of this structured and cushion style in terms of its presentation, and much of the DNA that we think of for Seiko really was developed from those original Turtle models. And I don't think the Turtle as well, because it's a name designated by collectors, not the brand, sometimes we don't think about it in the same manner. So the modern Turtle that probably best represents this is the SRPE 93. This is the traditional black dial Turtle configuration right at that entry point for the Prospect series. It retails right around that $500 price point, but you can get it for under that. Diameter is 45 millimeters, 13.2 millimeters, and a lug to lug of 47.6 1.7 millimeters with 200 meters of water resistance. This is ISO compliant, so this is a professional dive watch. The other thing that I would bring up about the Turtle is just this concept of dive watches wearing smaller than their case size might indicate. This is one of the champions of that idea. You look at 45 millimeters for a diameter and you're thinking, I can't go anywhere near that. I promise you, you probably can. Give this one a shot. This watch really goes further in selling that idea of a dive watch is more than meets the eye when it comes to its dimensions, wearing more compact. This is an idea that has now become part of Seiko's overall brand identity, and I think it was first championed by the Turtle. Further, the Turtle is also one of these watches that has so much connection to military timekeeping, reliability, and offering amazing value for money for a watch that can really just about handle anything. Now for this next watch, and it's really not a watch, it's a whole segment of the industry that I think comes as you start to get a little bit deeper in the hobby, and as you start to learn more about it, it really engulfs you in what this region is capable of. When you first think of watches, you probably are like many and you think of Switzerland. This is one of their main exports, and the brand, really the brand behind Swiss watchmaking is so strong on an international stage. Then maybe Japanese watchmaking's in the mix, but then you stumble on Germany, and a specific area in Germany that I want to talk about a bit more is Glashutte watchmaking. This is a place that if you're not fully into the world of collecting watches, you might not think of as a powerhouse. But as you start to learn more, this is where you recognize these unbelievable pockets of value. And that spans from more of an attainable perspective, just over $1,000, and it can go all the way up to a high horology tier. Almost at every segment, Glashutte watchmaking has an unbelievable answer to what the Swiss are doing, and the history behind this town is also very intriguing to get lost in its resurgence and bringing back watchmaking in the 1990s. So it started in 1845. This was a mining town. It transitioned into a watchmaking hub. Ferdinand Adolf Lange really is the father of this region when it comes to its watchmaking prowess. At the turn of the 20th century, well regarded in the entire international landscape of watch collecting. But then after World War II, just like much of the region of Saxony, decimated by World War II, and much of the watchmaking that was taking place in Glashutte around 30 minutes outside of Dresden, unfortunately fell out of favor. But then in the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you had this resurgence of different brands out there. And now to this moment, you have around 10 brands that are in this small little town of 7,000 people. That includes A. Lange & Söhne, you have Glashutte Regional, you have Nomos Glashutte, Mühle Glashutte, Tutima, Moritz Grossmann, Union Glashutte, and others as well. This was the birthplace of German watchmaking, and this town, in terms of its pride of in-house manufacturing, if you care about in-house manufacturing, that's a term that you hear all the time, and it's floating around as something that every brand is doing, when in reality in Switzerland, it is a supplier-rich nation. You have all of these specialists that are providing so much of the components, and that still is the case for some German watchmaking, but the ability to do it on your own was seen differently in Glashutte because of the stress that came from not being able to create everything in the region. So you had to really put it on yourself to create these smaller components. And this is the case of Nomos to this day. $1,000 to $5,000, maybe the most in-house produced watches that you're gonna come across. Mühle Glashutte as well, a family-owned operation where the leader of the company has the last name Mühle. So that is not something you typically will see. Lange, with Walter Lange reviving the brand with Gunter Blum line, this whole resurgence as one of the leading high horology brands, in Glashutte Regional for sitting as maybe one of the best values in luxury watchmaking, giving high horology types of finishes at prices that rival mass market production when it comes to luxury watchmaking. A lot of this comes down to the regulation and what it really means to have Glashutte on your watch. This is not something that simply as saying, hey, Glashutte watchmaking, that's what we are, we're from this region, we have connection there. There's actually a standard for having Glashutte on your dial. What they will quote is, a watch is protected under the Glashutte regulation. They must undergo at least 50% of the essential watch manufacturing stages in Glashutte. This is a small town, and a place as you start to get deeper into the weeds of watch collecting is a must to know. So this next watch is one of the most iconic pieces of all time. I think it falls victim to maybe not being seen as such because of it having more of an unorthodox appearance. But here we have the Tag Heuer Monaco. So the Monaco was one of the first automatic chronographs ever, and its design is also one of the most recognizable in the industry, especially with a square case design. We see a lot of rectangular cases, but a square case, that's not something that you'll see as often. The original Monaco was launched in 1969. It was one of the caliber 11 watches competing to bring the automatic chronograph to market. There were other brands involved in the release of this, so Heuer, Hamilton, Burend, Bois de Praz, and Breitling were all racing to beat Seiko and Zenith at the same time. A lot of conversation about who was first. It's easy to say, though, that this was among the first and one of the most important and innovative chronographs of that era. Now, the Monaco gained a lot of credibility in the racing community, Formula One. This was a watch commonly that you would see on the wrists of Formula One drivers and people associated with the sport. It was also seen in the 1971 film Le Mans, starring Steve McQueen, and really the legend was born after that. Wears well for a square case watch. There's a few aspects that I think allow this piece to separate and be that next level. It's striking both in its appearance on the dial. You have an interesting mix of different colors. The case silhouette is pretty much unmatched. The punchiness, both when you combine the silhouette with the dial, is so unique. And then you have all the lore behind this. Its connection to film, its connections to icons in racing, and being that also important watch when it came to the development of automatic chronographs. The Monaco is a weird watch, but it's one that has character, and that's why I think it's deserving to be included here. So for this next watch, this is one where I don't know if I would be as deep into collecting if it wasn't for its creation. This is also a watch that I connected the dots and was able to recognize why I liked it after the fact. I mean, I liked it initially when I saw it, but as I learned more about why it came to be, that's when I really fell in love with it. That is the Junghans Max Bill. My reaction to it is probably very similar to why it deserves to be on this list, because it's a bridge of connection to a lot of adjacent aspects that can enable further discovery into watches. What I mean by that is the creation of this watch came from a designer from the Bauhaus School of Design, Max Bill. It was also a design that originated from a wall clock. So basically what I see here with a design from Max Bill is there's a lot of purity in design principles. We hear about this concept of style and design, and we use those terms interchangeably, but I think this is a perfect representation of a watch that was designed first and then style came as a byproduct of that. The function of what is being created, the structure in which this watch came from a wall clock design to a wristwatch is perfectly understood. And that starts to make more sense, especially when you see some of the design attributes. You see the curvature of the dial, the important connection to thinking about type and how that can create a different visual impact. When I talked about that bridge of connection, this is where you see Bauhaus, you see mid-century, you see modern art coming into play with some of the adjacency and what this watch represents, and then also industrial design with watchmaking. If you can have a connection to any of those points, you might be able to find some connection to the Max Bill. And I think when you're looking at these gateways of collecting, I have talked to many people because of this watch. This was one of the pieces that got them into the hobby because it was a little bit different. It came from a different walk of life in regards to how it came to be, more of that industrial design. But I love this design. I think it's one that also is so appealing to those that might not even be into the subject of watches. But I think when it comes to the Max Bill, it's because this was a design first type of creation more than anything else. Now we move along to Omega, and there's not many Omega watches that are probably deserving to be on this list. It's very similar to Rolex. I mean, Rolex gets all the flowers when it comes to these early days of collecting. You know the names there. You often are going to know many of the names from Omega, but there's one exception that I will make, and that is with the Omega Railmaster. Here we're looking at the Omega Seamaster Railmaster because that is the modern creation that represents this idea. But what I'm really getting at here is more of the broader idea around the Railmaster. If you know the story, you know the famed trilogy series that was released in 1957. With that series came the Seamaster 300 and the Speedmaster, which set forth two icons of watch design. But another reference was created, it was the CK2914, and that was the Railmaster series. What the Railmaster was aimed to represent, whereas the Speedmaster was more of this racing chronograph before it started to take off for space, and the Seamaster clearly was more of a professional water-resistant dive watch. Here with the Railmaster, you had a watch that was more aimed towards engineers and for the railroad industry. And that was made to somewhat compete with the Rolex Milgauss and others of that same period with those elevated anti-magnetic properties. The Railmaster CK2914 from the original professional trilogy featured Arabic numerals, it had arrow markers and arrow handset, picking up some of the same stylistic flair found with the other Omega stablemates while offering different purposes. It shared this cohesive aesthetic in the process. But if you know how all of these models unfolded in the years to come, you recognize that the Railmaster basically was forgotten. It was in and out of the catalog several times. We just saw now a new rebirth, but it's never really had stable footing. But it had so many of the principles that we now think of when you are talking about Omega in the modern context. If you look at the master chronometer, if the Railmaster didn't exist, I don't think you would have this maybe pursuit of resistance against magnetic fields. The Railmaster was one of those original ideas around that concept. Another point I bring up about the Railmaster is the Aquaterra probably wouldn't be the watch that it is today without its invention. So as I present this next watch, I want to preface that what we talk about here versus the broader market of watch collectors, two different things. So for me to mention Grand Seiko as being part of it, especially this watch that's gonna be the one that I mentioned, some of you might be saying, what are you talking about, Teddy? Are you out of your mind to say that this is a watch that doesn't come to newer collectors? And I would say absolutely. Now, Grand Seiko, it's a brand that many enthusiasts know, but is Grand Seiko always the first luxury brand that you think of as you're starting to get into watch collecting? Maybe more than it used to be. I think Grand Seiko has increased its market share and you're seeing that more and more as that maybe being someone's first luxury watch purchase. But it's not the traditional way in which most enthusiasts start to get into the game. But once you get in, this is a brand that is absolutely there for you, and it's an either love it or kind of hate it brand at times. But if you can speak the language of Grand Seiko and it really speaks to you and what you care about, it's usually a marriage for life. So the Snowflake was the first watch that I think allowed that foundational element of what Grand Seiko is today on a broader global stage to come to be. Let's remember that Grand Seiko was not an international brand that long ago. It was a brand designated to the Japanese market for such a long period of time. It's really only in the last decade that we've started to see this ascension as a brand on the international stage. But if you go one step further, this is where we get to the watch that I want to present here. This is the SBGA 413. Probably right there when it comes to sales numbers with the Snowflake, it just doesn't have the same connection at the initial onset of that curiosity of watch collecting. It's that next phase as you start to get into Grand Seiko that you learn about this watch, maybe the second watch that you learn about from the brand. And this is where that Four Seasons collection really allowed Grand Seiko to stabilize as a consistently known name in the industry. The 413, also known as the Cherry Blossom, oftentimes, is a watch that takes many of the principles that come from the Snowflake. You have these sharply faceted markers on the dial, this sporadic but amazing looking texture to the surface of the dial that is so unique. And then the dimensionality that comes with the dial in its different looks at separate angles, different lighting conditions, with the 62GS case with titanium that I think creates one of the best wearing experiences for any Grand Seiko watch. It's bezel-less in its design, harsh lines and angles of the case that requires a variety of different surface treatments to be able to get to the end result, while packaging in spring drive on top of it. This was one of the watches that, as you're starting to get more into it, has a lot of fanfare, but a lot of wonder as well. The Snowflake was that initial recruiter of getting people into the world of Grand Seiko. This was the watch that was there at the orientation for you as you start to get more in. It is well known. It is one of the most asked about watches that we are typically answering questions of, I feel like, in our store and other questions online. But it's a watch still that comes with a bit more knowledge of the industry until you discover it, and it's only for select people in which that Grand Seiko language really resonates that actually comes to be. Moving right along, we'll go to a watch that's on my wrist, and I've been doing a lot of context building around presenting the watches here, and I hope you're okay with that because I'm trying to justify each one of these picks with some reasoning. I'm not just throwing out watches to you. But here we're talking about the Zenith Chronomaster Original. And why I'm including this watch is partially because of a few reasons. One is that El Primero, well regarded, but still in the grand scheme of things, it's mostly just a name people know. There's not the historical context around it. And if people do know Zenith, they know the El Primero, they have that surface level understanding, but it's maybe the perfect representation of this idea because you hear El Primero, how do you hear about it? Maybe it's because it's one of the first automatic chronographs. Maybe you hear about it because of the connection to the Rolex Daytona, which is part of that first guard of watches that so many people become familiar with. Or maybe it's just because you're looking for high frequency and this watch comes up, or you're learning about chronographs. The El Primero is commonly this stop on your watch collecting journey. And in addition to that, the movement almost clouds all judgment when it comes to this brand, where you almost can't even think about anything other than just the El Primero when you think of Zenith, not the watches that house the El Primero. And that's why I think the Chronomaster Original is one of these emblematic symbols of the idea of what we're trying to present here with this video. The Chronomaster Original is a watch that on many fronts is going to be more suitable than many people even know. I think when you look at chronographs, it's a very difficult thing to pull off. The ubiquity of a chronograph has gotten in the way of what probably is the reality, which is it's one of the most difficult watch complications or watches or movements to work on. If you talk to watchmakers, chronographs are tough to deal with. This is not on your first day on the job something that you will typically work on, especially to the tier of the El Primero, which is well over 300 components for the 3600 movement that we're talking about here in this watch. A couple of the reasons why I think the El Primero really separates and is a perfect watch to include here is going to be sizing. Many chronographs out there are going to be 40 millimeters and above. This returns to an era with a 38 millimeter case with the A386, a case architecture that I think allows it to differentiate from many in its class. You also have a thinner case profile than many other chronographs out there, especially of the automatic variety. We're under 13 millimeters thick. I know that's not thin by some standards, but if you're talking automatic chronographs where many of the movements on the inside might be 7 to 9 millimeters thick, this is pretty tough to come across. I mean, just look across the industry and just do the math on the thickness of chronographs, especially of the automatic variety at this price segment. This is not something you typically see. That 13 millimeter number is usually a huge turning point for a brand to separate. Also, the wearability on the lug-to-lug front is very different. 3600 movement giving you 10 beats per second, which compared to many chronographs out there, 3 hertz, 4 hertz, here we have 5 hertz. It's one of the leaders when it comes to high frequency movements. And when you think of high frequency, this could be the most famous high frequency movement of all time. The El Primero is a name you hear about, but it's not a name that's understood in its contributions to watchmaking as much as it probably should be, which is why it's on this list. So a gentleman that put pen to paper when it came to that first guard of watches that I mentioned, that first tier of where people discover, it's Gerald Genta. This is a man that's probably the most celebrated watch designer of all time. He was responsible for pieces that are some of the most iconic in watchmaking. But then there are other designs of Genta that don't get the same amount of flowers, but if you look at them in broader context, you recognize that, wait, how did this one take off? compared to this model? Or why do we put so much more attention here versus there? A lot of this comes down to branding, marketing, storytelling, and continued production of the same model over the years. But this is why I want to present the Ingenieur as one of these next steps. You look back to the 1970s, Genta designs are everywhere. It wasn't a knockout win initially with the Royal Oak when it came out. A lot of these designs were so abstract and avant-garde for the period that it really took time for them to take off. Then you had other watches from other designers like the 222, you had the Girard-Perregaux, Laureato, and others of the same ilk coming out in this time. But what is often overlooked, or maybe not celebrated as much, is there was another Genta design in the middle of the 1970s. It came out the same year as the Nautilus, is the Ingenieur SL. This is a watch that was a follow-up to some earlier creations of the Ingenieur. The Ingenieur debuted all the way back in 1955 with the initial reference 666, pretty diabolical reference number there. It was more of an elegant watch, but offered durability in the process, but also really its calling card was having this Faraday cage, the soft iron cage that allowed resistance to magnetic fields. And that was an important principle of this scientific engineering advancement of the watch itself. In 1976, Genta redesigned the Ingenieur. It was known as the SL model, changing up the dressy aesthetic to a more modernist integrated profile. When this watch was relaunched in 2023 at Watches and Wonders, I absolutely loved it. Like, I could see myself absolutely owning one of these in the near future. I have always liked the design. Some people have questions about its positioning. It took too long also for it to come out. But now that it's arrived, I think one thing that collectively we can't dispute is this is a very well thought out concept and design and what was being brought forth. I think they nailed the design of this watch. It is a beautiful look. You have this grid pattern dial. It comes in several different variants. Titanium, you have steel options, gold pieces, ceramic. Seeing all of the different elements of what IWC is known for nowadays and fusing those into the Ingenieur, which is a classic and also a watch in that integrated steel sports type of genre that is not talked about nearly as much. So for collectors, the JLC Reverso is absolutely an icon, but for those that are first getting into watch collecting, I would say that the way that many people think is mostly from a shape perspective when you're talking about the Reverso. What is another watch that often will lead you to the Reverso? I think for many, it's the Cartier Tank is that first entry point into this style of design. If you look at both of these watches side by side, entirely different watches, but they always get lumped together because of that shape and form. And the Reverso is usually the secondary discovery in that process, but a watch that I have always adored for what it represents. I talk about this concept of wonder when you're discovering a watch. The Reverso was that for me. There were so many layers to what it was able to bring forth when I tried it on for the first time. Nothing else really wears like it. Then you get to learn about the case structure and how there's over 50 components in the case itself, the different models that come into play, the lore around it being created for polo players back in 1931, and the connection to JLC and Edmond Jaeger and Antoine Lecoultre and what they were able to do in bringing together a concept that allowed them to be an industrial powerhouse for so many in the industry, and the Reverso being that main leading light for this brand. I just have always loved this watch, and I think it is a perfect representation of what we're talking about here today. It's that next guard of discovery for those that are getting further into the collecting hobby. The Reverso itself can be combined into a variety of different case silhouettes. They're all very similar in the presentation, but they have mild differences in their dimensions. I think the watch that really sealed it for me was the Duo Face. This is a watch design that came out in 1994 initially, but has been evolved on. I have shown these watches to people, and I have never received a consistent, strong reaction than showing someone this watch for the first time. Because yes, it's expensive, but it's not of another world. Like someone of at least solid means could really aspire to own this piece. This isn't a watch that costs as much as a house where I'm from in the United States. Very expensive. I don't want to sound like I'm out of touch here in recognizing that $13,000, $15,000 is a lot of money, but the ratio of how this watch is able to create wonder and excitement and have those what the F moment when you hand someone these watches for the first time, it's pretty unmatched compared to any other watch in its class because of the case and how it's able to present itself. The dual face especially, when you can just show somebody, hey, check this out, flip it around, whole other watch on the other side, that is such a fun thing for me to do. Now, maybe I get my fun from strange ways compared to most people out there, but this is really what I'm talking about when it comes to the Reverso and the way it's able to transfer emotion through what it was designed. It's an unquestioned icon and also one that I certainly adore. There's a lot of debates around what is the most iconic watch type of all time. I would go with the dive watch. What is the most iconic dive watch of all time? The Rolex Submariner. This whole craze around the 1950s and the development of dive watches was something that completely changed the industry and the trajectory for a brand like Rolex and the watches that were being brought forth. There were other brands that were in line with producing watches in the same period for the dive watch genre. And one that is that next level of going deeper, I think, is the Blancpain 50 Fathoms. The 50 Fathoms, one of the most important dive watches of all time. There's always this contested idea, what came first, what came first. I don't want to get into that, but what can't be disputed is the 50 Fathoms was one of those watches that shaped the whole arena that came with dive watches and so many others that came in the 1960s and 70s as scuba diving, professional diving, and deep water exploration became more mainstream. Many of the core principles of the 50 Fathoms found their way in other dive watches. You had this high contrast dial, elapsed time bezel on the outside, use of luminous markings on the dials for easy legibility. You also had the structure of its case back to create a tighter seal for water resistance ratings. And then where the 50 Fathom sits today, it's a watch that is almost a pioneer of a different idea around a dive watch. When so many people think of dive watches, they think of utility, but are dive watches really a watch of utility nowadays? Are watches really tools anymore? I don't know. I could have a whole discussion about that, but where the 50 Fathoms now sits today is this combination of the past of this utilitarian idea fused with now the brand of Blancpain today is a high horology brand. They produce high-end, well-finished movements. The 1315 for many of the 50 Fathoms now is one of the best finished movements in its class. It has a long power reserve with 3 barrels in unison working with one another to create that long reserve and stable balance power in the process. Deep cut anglage on the side of the bridges and what is being presented on that front. So this is what the 50 Fathoms is. It's a different shift in the dive watch design style where it's not so much just about looking for something that can time your dives, but also be an expression of this evolution of watchmaking that has come now with this brand very different than it was years ago in the 1950s when the 50 Fathoms came to be. And now for our final watch on the list here today, I have Vacheron Constantin with the 222. The reason this watch is here is partially because what I referred to earlier about Genta designs, and this watch being always lumped in with the Genta designs and sometimes often misquoted as being a Genta design itself. I can recall back 2018, I was able to tour my first manufacturer in the watchmaking industry. The brand that invited me, opened their doors, was Vacheron, and I was really excited to go, went to their headquarters in Geneva, toured their facility, and then at the end, they pulled out some of the pieces from their archive. Vacheron is one of the oldest companies in watchmaking, and when they pulled out the 222, I remember just having a puzzled response to it at first. I liked it. I didn't know why. And it was so different than anything that you would see from watches of that integrated style at that period. Now, so many people joke that there are more attainable watches that look like the 222 now, but let's remember, back in 1977, this was a different take on a very busy crowd, and now it's become even busier with some of the modern takes on integrated sports watches. But Vacheron always has this understated cool. There's like this nonchalance of not trying too hard, and the 222 is exactly that. It's not able to lean on the Genta connection. It's one of the last of the integrated sports watches or integrated watches of the 1970s. It came at the tail end of many of the creations, like the Nautilus in 1976 and the AP Royal Oak in 1972. The 222 is also a piece that slightly is an answer to those that they want a statement piece, but they don't want it to be as in your face. If you wear a Royal Oak, you wear a Nautilus, even an Aquanaut, those are watches that are more widely recognized. And you look at a 222, the structure of its case, its silhouette, it's more of a tonneau shape style. Doesn't have these large screws that are showcasing itself. The facets aren't as highly reflective and polished, but it's still exceptionally finished. Everything is more understated. It's all more of like a secret to be discovered. The scalloped edge of the bezel, you have the small little Maltese cross insignia on the lower portion of one of the lugs. It's also much smaller than many of the integrated sports watches out there, with a case size of 37 millimeters in diameter in comparison to many watches that are hulking with their wrist presence. The 222 is this perfect answer of quiet luxury to a genre of watch that is so in misalignment with this idea. If you own an integrated sports watch, typically it's saying that you want other people to know what you got. And that's okay. I'm all for that. That's fine. The 222 is also that, but only for those that are in the know. But all right, guys, that's my video here today, looking at some watches that enthusiasts that are getting into the hobby might not know, but should likely soon in their future. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Really do appreciate that. I wanted to do this video because I always see very similar ideas around how people get into collecting. The past sometimes are often shared, and these are the watches that would be these paths of discovery that are right there as you get past that first line of defense of watches that typically people know about in those early stages. Were there other watches that you think could have been included on this list, like that next section of collectability that comes up, these icons that are right behind the icons that are oftentimes maybe not considered right at the initial point? Leave some comments down below about that. And is there one watch that you think best represents this idea? I'd love to hear that too. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer for all the brands that we carry, over 35 brands in our assortment now. If you're ever looking for a watch, we'd absolutely love to help you out. Allows us to keep doing what we're doing here with all the content on this channel and beyond. Every purchase from our website comes with quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.